A local pastor now facing continuous sexual assault of a child. According to official documents, Robert L. Carter repeatedly raped a young family member, even impregnating her.
The call came in late, just past midnight on a quiet night in 2018. A baby, barely hours old, had been left at a Houston fire station. No note, no explanation, just silence. No one knew where the child had come from. No one knew who had carried that life into the world, only to abandon it in the dead of night. For weeks, the questions hung in the air, unanswered. Until one day, a girl, no longer a child, not yet fully a woman, found the strength to speak. And when she did, the truth tore through an entire community like a wrecking ball. She had been carrying a secret for nearly a decade. A secret she never asked for. A secret that was forced upon her. It started when she was 7. A child in a home where she should have been safe. A child in a church where she should have been protected. But there was no safety. No protection. Only him. The infant found at that fire station wasn't abandoned by some desperate stranger making an impossible choice. That baby was evidence. Evidence of over 600 acts of sexual violence. Evidence of a childhood stolen. Evidence that would eventually lead investigators to a man who spent every Sunday standing behind a pulpit, preaching about righteousness. His name was Robert L. Carter. Bishop. Senior pastor. Respected leader in Houston's religious community. And for 12 years he raped his own niece. This is her story. But more importantly, this is a warning about how monsters hide in plain sight. How institutions fail the vulnerable. And how one girl's courage finally brought a predator to justice. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to where this nightmare truly began. Before we continue, I need to tell you something uncomfortable. Something you probably don't want to hear. Stories like this only reach people when you make it happen. Right now, YouTube's algorithm is watching to see if you care enough to engage. If you just watch and leave, this story dies here. It reaches maybe a few hundred people. But if you subscribe, if you comment, it could reach hundreds of thousands. And here's why that matters. Right now, at this very moment, there are children suffering in silence just like this girl did. Children being abused by people in positions of trust. And the only way we stop it is by refusing to look away. So if you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe survivors deserve a voice, prove it. Hit that subscribe button. Show YouTube this content matters. And if you won't subscribe, at least tell me why in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Is it because you don't care? Because you're too busy? Because you think one subscription doesn't make a difference? Because here's the truth. Your silence in real life is exactly what predators count on. They bank on people being too uncomfortable, too busy, too apathetic to speak up. They survive because good people do nothing. So subscribe if you stand against this. Comment if you won't. But don't just scroll past. Don't be part of the silence that allows this to continue. Now, let me tell you about the man who destroyed this child's life. And more importantly, let me tell you the things the mainstream media never reported. Robert L. Carter wasn't just some pastor at a small neighborhood church. He was a bishop. A title that carried weight in Houston's religious community. He had influence across multiple congregations, a ministry spanning over 20 years. But here's what the news outlets didn't tell you. What they completely overlooked in their coverage. Carter worked in hospice care for nearly 2 decades. Think about that for a moment. He had access to families in their most vulnerable moments. Families watching their loved ones die. Families in crisis, desperate for comfort, for guidance, for someone to lean on. And he positioned himself as exactly that person. The comforter. The spiritual guide who would see them through their darkest hours. How many other victims were there? How many grieving families did he exploit? We may never know. His specialty at church was even more revealing. He ran the troubled youth ministry. Specifically, he mentored young girls from broken homes. Girls whose fathers were absent. Girls whose mothers worked multiple jobs and couldn't always be there. Every single red flag was there. But nobody saw them. Or maybe they did and they just didn't want to believe what they were seeing. The victim in this case was his niece. But the relationship was more complicated than that simple label suggests. Her family didn't just trust him. They depended on him. Her mother worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat. Carter offered to help. He presented himself as the stable male figure this little girl needed. He would pick her up from school. Take her to church activities. Mentor her spiritually. The family was grateful. They saw his involvement as a blessing. A successful religious leader taking time to invest in their daughter's life. How could that be anything but good? The grooming started when she was 6 years old. 1 full year before the sexual abuse began. He normalized inappropriate touching by calling it uncle affection. He created special bonds through private trips and one-on-one mentoring sessions. He gave her gifts, money, the kind of attention she craved from a father figure who wasn't there. He made himself indispensable in her life. Made her dependent on him emotionally before he ever touched her sexually. This is the classic predator playbook. Isolation, normalization, creating dependency. But Carter had something most predators don't have. He had religious authority, and that made him virtually untouchable. Greater Bible Way Church in Sunnyside knew something was wrong. Former members have come forward since his arrest, and what they're saying is damning. They saw him take young girls into his private office regularly. The door was always locked during these counseling sessions. He insisted on driving girls home alone after services. Multiple people complained about his behavior over the years. But every single complaint was dismissed, called a misunderstanding, written off as people misinterpreting his pastoral care. What? Because his charisma brought in donations. His sermons filled seats. His reputation brought prestige to the church. So there was an unspoken rule that everyone followed. Don't question the bishop. This is the pattern we see again and again. Authority plus institutional protection equals invisibility. And for 12 years, Robert L. Carter remained completely invisible while he committed unspeakable acts against a child. Let me walk you through what actually happened during those 12 years. The details that most outlets were too uncomfortable to report. Because understanding the full scope of this abuse is the only way to prevent it from happening again. It started in 2008. She was 7 years old. Court documents state that he would come into her bedroom and make her perform sex acts on him on a nightly basis. But let's do the math that nobody else is doing. 600 times over 12 years. That's 50 assaults per year. Nearly once per week, every single week for over a decade. Think about what that means. This wasn't opportunistic abuse. This was systematic, calculated, planned. The locations tell you everything you need to know about how carefully he orchestrated this. Her home when the family was asleep downstairs. His grandmother's house during family gatherings. The H-E-B parking lot before he dropped her off at school. His private office at the church during counseling sessions. Behind the church building after Sunday services. Each location had a built-in alibi. A reason for them to be alone together that no one would question. And he had his threat ready from day one. No one will believe you. If you tell, I'll say you came to me. I'll say you wanted this. He was planting the seeds of self-doubt in a 7-year-old child's mind. By the time she was 9, she had stopped fighting. She had learned that resistance was pointless. This is what psychologists call learned helplessness. When a victim realizes that nothing they do will change their situation, so they simply endure. When she turned 12, everything escalated. The abuse became violent rape. What changed? Her body was developing. And his obsession intensified as she got older. Here's a detail from the case files that the media didn't report. He photographed her, created visual documentation of the abuse, and then used those images as a new form of control. I have proof you wanted this, he told her. Proof that you're just as guilty as I am. She started showing symptoms that everyone should have recognized. Severe anxiety, depression. She began having thoughts of self-harm. Her behavior at school changed dramatically. Teachers noticed. They saw a troubled teen. A girl who was falling behind academically, acting out in class, withdrawing from friends. But nobody asked the right questions. Nobody looked deeper to find out what was causing these changes. This is one of the failures we need to talk about. Educators are trained to spot behavioral red flags. But too often they see the symptoms without investigating the cause. They label a child as troubled without asking what's troubling them. By the time she was 16, she discovered she was pregnant, carrying her rapist child. The terror she must have felt in that moment is unimaginable. But Carter had already thought this through. He had a plan. He forced her to hide the pregnancy, made her wear baggy clothes, isolated her from friends who might notice. There was no prenatal care, no doctor visits. She could have died and he didn't care. Court records reveal that he researched home birth online. He prepared for this possibility, which tells you he knew exactly what he was doing when he continued to rape her without protection. The birth happened alone in her bedroom closet, while her family slept just downstairs. She bit down on her own clothes to muffle the screams. She nearly bled to death on that closet floor. And when it was over, when she had delivered his baby in complete isolation, Carter came and took the child. He left her there, bleeding and traumatized, took the newborn and drove to that fire station. He used Texas's safe haven laws to his advantage. Laws designed to prevent infant deaths became his cover. By leaving the baby at a fire station, he ensured there would be no investigation. No questions asked. Just an anonymous drop-off. Then he drove home. Went to sleep. Woke up the next morning and prepared his Sunday sermon. He stood before his congregation hours after abandoning his own child and preached about God's grace. About righteousness. About living a life of moral integrity. And nobody knew. Nobody suspected. The girl who had just given birth alone was sitting in the congregation, still bleeding, still in pain. And he looked right at her while he preached. This continued for 3 more years. 3 more years of abuse after she gave birth. Because he knew she would never tell. He had broken her so completely that she couldn't imagine a world where anyone would believe her story. Until finally, at 19 years old, her body and mind couldn't take any more. At 19 years old, she was hospitalized after a suicide attempt. The pain had become too much to carry. But here's what the public doesn't know. This wasn't her first attempt. It was her third. She had tried twice before to escape the nightmare she was living. Twice before she had reached a point where death seemed like the only way out. And both times the system failed to see what was really happening. A psychiatrist noticed the pattern. Severe trauma-related symptoms that didn't match the explanations she was giving. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Dissociation. Self-harm behaviors. These weren't just depression symptoms. These were the markers of ongoing abuse. But she still wouldn't speak. Still couldn't bring herself to say the words out loud. To name what had been done to her for 12 years. And then Carter made a mistake. He visited her in the hospital. Even there, even when she was at her absolute lowest point, he needed to maintain control. He leaned close while the nurses weren't looking. Whispered in her ear. "Remember what I said. Nobody will believe you. This is your fault as much as mine." But something inside her shifted in that moment. Not courage. Not some sudden burst of strength. It was exhaustion. Complete and total exhaustion. She realized that this would never end. Not unless she ended it herself or unless she finally spoke the truth. He would keep abusing her until one of them was dead. Those were the only 2 outcomes she could see. When she was released from the hospital, her father noticed something different. She was distant in a new way. Fearful. She flinched every time Carter's name was mentioned in conversation. One night, he found her crying uncontrollably in her room. Not the quiet tears she had cried for years. This was something deeper. Something breaking. He demanded answers. "What happened to you? What is going on? I can't help you if you don't tell me." And the floodgates opened. 12 years of silence came pouring out in one devastating confession. She told him everything. Every detail. Every location. Every threat Carter had made. Her father's world collapsed in that moment. First came disbelief. This couldn't be true. Not Carter. Not the man he had trusted with his daughter's spiritual development. Then came rage. A fury so intense he had to be physically restrained from going to Carter's house. And finally, the worst emotion of all. Guilt. How did I not see this? The signs had been there all along. Her behavioral changes at 7 years old. Again at 12. Again at 16. Her fear when Carter came to visit. Her reluctance to be alone with him. The late nights when Carter claimed to be mentoring her. The special trips. The private counseling sessions. Every red flag had been waving right in front of his face and he had missed them all. This guilt nearly destroyed him. Still does. He's spoken about it in interviews since the arrest. The knowledge that his daughter was being raped while he slept downstairs. That she gave birth in a closet while he was in the same house. But in that moment he did the right thing. He called the police immediately. No hesitation. No concern for family reputation or church standing. His daughter had been hurt and someone needed to pay. Detectives arrived and interviewed her for 6 hours straight. She provided details that only a true victim would know. Specific dates she could remember. The exact layout of his church office. Words he had said to her. Threats he had made. She described the pattern of abuse. How it happened more frequently during church revivals when he was energized and felt invincible. How it slowed down slightly when his wife was homesick. The small variations that proved this wasn't a fabricated story. Investigators started pulling records. They found something interesting in the files from 2018. An abandoned baby at a fire station. DNA had been collected and stored, but there had been no suspect to compare it against. Until now. They requested a DNA sample from Carter. And they compared it to the infant from the fire station. The results came back. 99.9% match. Robert L. Carter was the biological father of that abandoned child. Physical evidence had just met eyewitness testimony. The case against him was no longer just her word against his. It was scientific proof that corroborated every single thing she had said. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Multiple charges. Continuous sexual abuse of a child. Aggravated sexual assault. Endangering a child. Each charge carrying decades of potential prison time. But when officers went to bring him in, they found his house empty. His phone disconnected. His car gone. Pastor Robert L. Carter had disappeared. When news broke that Carter was wanted on multiple counts of sexual assault, he vanished. Police checked his home, his church, his known associates. Nothing. For 48 hours, one of Houston's most prominent pastors was in the wind. But here's the thing about men like Carter. They don't run far. They can't. Their entire identity is built on the power they hold over others. The admiration. The respect. The authority. Officers eventually found him at a church member's house. Not hiding in shame. Not cowering from justice. He was there being sheltered. Protected. Hidden by people who knew exactly what he was accused of. And before he turned himself in, he released a statement through his attorney. These are false accusations. This is an attack on the church. A conspiracy to destroy my ministry. He didn't address the DNA evidence. Didn't explain why his genetic material was found on an abandoned infant. Just blanket denials and claims of persecution. When he finally turned himself in after the media pressure became too intense to resist, his mugshot told you everything. No remorse. No shame. Just cold, hard anger. The rage of a man who believed he was untouchable and couldn't understand why the world wasn't bowing to him anymore. Bond was set at $200,000. He posted it the same day. Walked out of jail while his victim was still in therapy trying to process 12 years of trauma. She had found the courage to speak. Had given a 6-hour statement to police. Had relived every moment of abuse to help build the case. And her reward was seeing him walk free, living his life, while she waited for a trial that might never bring justice. The community's response revealed everything wrong with blind faith. Greater Bible Way Church split down the middle. Half believed the victim. Saw the DNA evidence. Recognized the pattern of abuse. The other half believed him. Stood by their pastor. Created a Support Bishop Carter campaign on social media. These weren't fringe members. These were deacons. Longtime congregants. People who had known this girl since she was a child. They claimed the devil was attacking their bishop. That this troubled young woman was lying for attention. That a man of God couldn't possibly be capable of such acts. Some went further. They harassed the victim's family. Death threats appeared on social media. Accusations that they were trying to extort money from the church. Messages telling them they would burn in hell for bearing false witness. Her father released a statement to the local news. We've lost our community. The people we worshipped with for years have turned their backs on us. They've chosen to protect a predator instead of a child. But something else was happening quietly in the background. Other victims started coming forward. At least 3 other young women contacted investigators with eerily similar stories. He had mentored them through the youth ministry. Started with inappropriate comments. Graduated to touching. Then to sexual assault. Same pattern. Same grooming tactics. Same threats about nobody believing them. They had been too terrified to report at the time. Too ashamed. Too convinced that he was right when he said no one would take their word over a bishop's. But seeing this girl's courage, seeing someone finally stand up to him, gave them hope. Prosecutors wanted to investigate. Wanted to bring additional charges. But the statute of limitations had expired on their cases. The law said it had been too long. Justice was no longer available to them. So Carter potentially destroyed multiple lives over decades. Abused his position of trust again and again. And only one case was prosecutable. Only one victim would get her day in court. Pretrial hearings began in early 2025. Ann Carter's defense strategy became crystal clear. They were going to attack her credibility. Use her psychiatric history against her. Look at her mental health records, his attorneys argued. She's unstable. She has a history of suicidal ideation. She's been hospitalized multiple times. Can we really trust the word of someone so troubled? They suggested she had wanted the relationship as she got older. That maybe it started as abuse when she was young, but evolved into something consensual in her teens. Classic victim blaming dressed up in legal language. But the prosecution had evidence that demolished that defense. Her detailed testimony that remained consistent across multiple interviews. The DNA proof that he had fathered her child. Medical records showing signs of sexual trauma dating back to when she was 7. And then investigators found his phone. The one he thought he had wiped clean. Digital forensics recovered deleted text messages. Messages that showed his consciousness of guilt. Delete everything he had texted an unknown contact. They can't prove anything without evidence. Messages to the victim herself. Remember you wanted this. Remember you came to me. Most damning of all were his internet searches. Statute of limitations for sex crimes in Texas. How long before sexual assault charges expire? Can DNA evidence be challenged in court? These weren't the searches of an innocent man. These were the searches of someone who knew exactly what he had done and was trying to figure out if he could get away with it. His defense began to crumble during pretrial motions. Rumors of a plea deal started circulating. His attorneys wanted him to take a deal. Plead guilty to reduce charges. Avoid the public spectacle of a trial. But the victim refused. After everything he had done to her, after 12 years of forcing her into silence, she wanted the world to hear her story. She wanted a public trial where every detail would be entered into the record. She wanted other victims to see that justice was possible. That powerful men could be held accountable. That speaking up, no matter how terrifying, could lead to real consequences. The trial is still pending as of this recording. Carter has pleaded not guilty to all charges. He maintains his innocence despite the mountain of evidence against him. But one thing is certain. This case has already exposed the rot at the heart of institutional religion. The way churches protect predators. The way congregations choose comfort over truth. The way power and authority create perfect conditions for abuse. 6:41 a.m. Write the next section. 6:43 a.m. Let me break down exactly what failed in this case. Because understanding these failures is the only way we prevent the next Robert L. Carter from destroying another child's life. First, the institutional failures. Churches across this country operate with almost no oversight. No mandatory training on recognizing abuse. No protocols for protecting children. Background checks happen when someone is hired and then never again. Carter had unrestricted one-on-one access to children for over 20 years. Locked doors during counseling sessions. Private car rides. Overnight trips. Every single best practice for child safety was ignored because he was a respected leader. Churches need to implement strict policies. No adult should ever be alone with a child behind a closed door. Ever. Not for counseling. Not for mentoring. Not for any reason. There should always be windows. Always be another adult present. Always be accountability. Anonymous reporting systems need to exist for congregation members who see concerning behavior. Because people did see red flags with Carter. Multiple people complained. But there was no safe way to report without facing retaliation from church leadership. When donations and reputation matter more than child safety, predators thrive. It's that simple. Now let's talk about the family failures. And I say this not to blame the victim's parents, but to help other families recognize what they missed. Trust is not the same as blind faith. Carter was family. He was a religious leader. He seemed trustworthy. But trustworthy people don't insist on being alone with children. They don't get defensive when questioned. They don't isolate kids from their support systems. The warning signs were there. Behavioral changes at specific ages. 7 years old, she changed. 12 years old, she changed again. 16 years old, another shift. Each change coincided with an escalation in abuse. She developed fear around a specific person. Didn't want to be alone with Uncle Carter. Made excuses to avoid church events where he would be present. Children don't develop these fears randomly. Regression behaviors appeared. Bedwetting after she had been potty trained for years. Nightmares. Anxiety about going to sleep. These are classic signs of sexual abuse that parents need to recognize. She had sexual knowledge that was inappropriate for her age. Made comments or asked questions that didn't match what a child her age should know. This is often the clearest indicator that something is wrong. Parents need to have the uncomfortable conversations. Ask direct questions. Create an environment where children feel safe reporting abuse. And most importantly, believe them when they try to tell you. Because here's the truth. This girl tried to signal for help. Not in words, but in behavior. In fear. In the way she pulled away from Carter at family gatherings. The way she got quiet when his name was mentioned. Children rarely say, "I'm being raped." They say, "I don't want to go to Uncle's house." They say, "My stomach hurts when we go to church." They act out in school. They withdraw from friends. They fail classes they used to pass easily. We need to learn to hear what they're not saying. To read the language of trauma that children speak when they're too afraid or too ashamed to use words. The school system failed her too. Teachers saw a troubled teen. Saw declining grades and behavioral problems. But nobody asked what was causing the trouble. Schools need better trauma-informed training. Educators need to understand that sudden behavioral changes aren't just teenage rebellion. They're often symptoms of abuse happening at home. Mandatory reporters need real teeth. It's not enough to require teachers to report suspected abuse. There need to be consequences when they don't. When they see the signs and choose to look away. Child Protective Services needs funding and resources to actually investigate reports. Too many cases fall through the cracks because caseworkers are overwhelmed. Because the system is broken and underfunded. And finally, we need to talk about what this victim went through to get justice. She had to relive her trauma in police interviews, in court hearings, in medical examinations. The system re-traumatizes survivors at every turn. She had to face her abuser walking free on bond. Had to see him in her community. Had to watch half her church defend him and attack her. This is why so many victims never report. Because the process of seeking justice is almost as traumatic as the abuse itself. We need to do better. Now here's where I ask you to make a choice. This video took over 40 hours to research, script, and produce. I could have made something easier. Something that gets more views and makes more money. But I chose to tell this story because it matters. Because somewhere right now, a child is being abused by someone in a position of trust. And the only way we stop it is by refusing to be silent. YouTube's algorithm will only push this video to more people if you engage. That's how the platform works. If you watch and leave, this reaches a few hundred people. If you subscribe and comment, it could reach hundreds of thousands. So here's my question for you. Do you actually care about protecting children? Or are you just going to feel sad for 15 minutes and then scroll to the next video? If you care, if you genuinely want to see channels like this succeed, hit the subscribe button. Show the algorithm that real stories matter more than clickbait. And if you won't subscribe, I want you to tell me why in the comments. I'm not asking this to guilt trip you. I genuinely want to understand. Is it because you don't think true crime channels are credible? Because you're already subscribed to too many channels? Because you think one subscription doesn't make a difference? Tell me. Because I need to know if content like this is worth making. If survivor stories deserve to be told. If prevention matters to anyone besides the victims. Right now, Carter's trial is still pending. He hasn't been sentenced. Justice hasn't been served yet. And if this case disappears from public attention, if people stop caring, there's a real chance he could walk with a reduced sentence. So subscribe and I'll update you when the verdict comes in. I'll tell you what sentence he receives. Whether this survivor finally gets the justice she deserves. Comment below if you have thoughts on how we prevent cases like this. What warning signs people should watch for. What changes need to happen in churches and schools. But please don't just scroll away. Because that's what Robert L. Carter counted on for 12 years. Your silence. Your discomfort. Your belief that someone else would handle it. This girl suffered in silence because everyone around her looked away. Everyone missed the signs. Everyone chose comfort over confrontation. Don't look away now. Don't let her story disappear into the algorithm. Don't let predators like Carter keep winning because good people choose to do nothing. Subscribe. Comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Make noise. Because silence is what allows monsters to thrive. Your move. Let me break down exactly what failed in this case. Because understanding these failures is the only way we prevent the next Robert L. Carter from destroying another child's life. First, the institutional failures. Churches across this country operate with almost no oversight. No mandatory training on recognizing abuse. No protocols for protecting children. Background checks happen when someone is hired and then never again. Carter had unrestricted one-on-one access to children for over 20 years. Locked doors during counseling sessions. Private car rides. Overnight trips. Every single best practice for child safety was ignored because he was a respected leader. Churches need to implement strict policies. No adult should ever be alone with a child behind a closed door. Ever. Not for counseling. Not for mentoring. Not for any reason. There should always be windows. Always be another adult present. Always be accountability. Anonymous reporting systems need to exist for congregation members who see concerning behavior. Because people did see red flags with Carter. Multiple people complained. But there was no safe way to report without facing retaliation from church leadership. When donations and reputation matter more than child safety, predators thrive. It's that simple. Now let's talk about the family failures. And I say this not to blame the victim's parents, but to help other families recognize what they missed. Trust is not the same as blind faith. Carter was family. He was a religious leader. He seemed trustworthy. But trustworthy people don't insist on being alone with children. They don't get defensive when questioned. They don't isolate kids from their support systems. The warning signs were there. Behavioral changes at specific ages. 7 years old, she changed. 12 years old, she changed again. 16 years old, another shift. Each change coincided with an escalation in abuse. She developed fear around a specific person. Didn't want to be alone with Uncle Carter. Made excuses to avoid church events where he would be present. Children don't develop these fears randomly. Parents need to have the uncomfortable conversations. Ask direct questions. Create an environment where children feel safe reporting abuse. And most importantly, believe them when they try to tell you. Because here's the truth. This girl tried to signal for help. Not in words, but in behavior. In fear. In the way she pulled away from Carter at family gatherings. The way she got quiet when his name was mentioned. Children rarely say, "I'm being raped." They say, "I don't want to go to Uncle's house." They say, "My stomach hurts when we go to church." They act out in school. They withdraw from friends. They fail classes they used to pass easily. We need to learn to hear what they're not saying. To read the language of trauma that children speak when they're too afraid or too ashamed to use words.